All right, lots to take you through this Monday, but first, our top story. India and China have agreed to end the standoff on the Doklam Plateau. A statement from the External Affairs Ministry said, and I quote, "Expeditious disengagement of border personnel at the face-off site at Doklam has been agreed to and is ongoing," unquote. The statement added that the two countries had been in touch diplomatically on the issue for some time now. It said that India had conveyed its views, its concerns, its interests to the Chinese. Now, just to take you through what has been going on, the standoff began on June 16th when Chinese troops began laying a road on the Doklam Plateau. China claims ownership to the plateau, even though Bhutan also claims similar ownership. The two sides have held several rounds of discussions on it, but inconclusively. There was an understanding which included India that neither side would alter the status quo on the ground. China's road building violated that understanding. At Bhutan's request, India sent in troops to stop the Chinese from building the road there. This was the first time that India intervened in support of a third country against China.
It is a tremendous diplomatic victory for our country that both the countries' armies have agreed to pull back. This standoff was going on since about 2 months, and despite Chinese threats through media that we should withdraw, otherwise there will be a war, we were hanging on there. All the credit goes to the government decision to hang on there, and that's why we have got a diplomatic victory.
It's a huge victory for India. Right from day one, India had been suggesting that the only solution to this issue is that both countries withdraw back to the positions that they occupied on the 16th of June and thereafter indulge in a dialogue. We showed unbelievable maturity in the face of threats, and nothing worked as far as China is concerned. In the ultimate analysis, China has realized that China has stood totally exposed in front of the world.
The breakthrough between the two big countries, India and China, is a great message for both the countries. It is a very happy situation that both countries have agreed to withdraw their forces from the Doklam Plateau. This message will go that both such big countries can solve their problems among themselves without involving any nation like UNO and other countries also.
My sense is that if the disengagement protocol is adhered to in a mutually acceptable manner, for India and China, and the political leadership in both sides should be commended for the manner in which they have handled it. India has shown very commendable levels of restraint, firmness, and also I think a certain respect for the protocol of how to deal with a major power like China in such a situation.
All right, so it all began in June when India had to intervene at Bhutan's request, might I add, when China started road-building exercises on the Doklam Plateau. China historically claims that this Doklam Plateau is part of Chinese sovereign territory, but that's a claim that is disputed by Bhutan. In fact, there's been an agreement between the two countries that the status quo should not be altered. However, the road-building exercise was perceived by both Bhutan and India as a threat to their strategic and security interests. India was asked by Bhutan to intervene, and it did. It prevented that road-building exercise from going through. This has also got major implications for India. Just look at that map in front of you. It gives you an idea of how strategic Doklam is in terms of its proximity to the chicken's neck. It can cause great concerns for India's security, and therefore India stepped in. Since then, we've seen a volley of words between the Chinese Foreign Ministry and the Indian External Affairs Ministry. However, it's all come down to this point with a disengagement taking place. India saying that, but what exactly is China saying to all of this? To make sense of that, I'm joined on the broadcast by my colleague Ramesh Ramachandran. He is joining in from the international desk. Ramesh, the Indian External Affairs Ministry, very categorical, that statement. The term used, of course, disengagement. What are we hearing from the Chinese side about all of this?
Well, first things first, Aisha, the Indian government did issue a statement, but there's been no statement whatsoever from the Chinese side. What the Chinese have said so far is only in response to questions posed by journalists who attended the Chinese Foreign Ministry briefing. Now, that said, to understand or to break it down into simple, digestible capsules, if I can put it that way, one has to understand the text, the subtext, and the context of all that has happened in the last few hours. Now, talking about China in particular, Aisha, China, the spokesperson was responding to questions posed by the some of the Indian journalists who are based out of Beijing. And essentially the thrust of the submission of the spokesperson was, one, that China will continue to exercise its sovereign rights on the Doklam plateau. That's the big takeaway to my mind from the Chinese spokesperson's briefing. The spokesman also went on to say that China will uphold territorial integrity in accordance with historical conventions, namely referring to the 19th century agreement between China and the erstwhile British company or the colonial rulers here in South Asia. And also, the China says both India can get along with China to uphold peace and tranquility along the line of actual control, and also that both countries can and should respect each other's territorial integrity. So that's what the Chinese have said. And to understand what is happening, Aisha, one needs to understand also what has been left unsaid by both sides.
Right.
From India's perspective, Aisha, India has clearly not mentioned anything about a withdrawal of troops by the Chinese side. Correspondingly, on the Chinese side, what they have left unsaid is that whether they will continue to build that disputable road on Doklam or not. So a very delicate balance or equilibrium or understanding reached between India and China. The proof of the pudding will be in the eating, and we'll come to know as we go forward whether China will repeat the Doklam-like standoff in Doklam or anywhere along the thousands of kilometer long LAC that separates India from Tibet and China.
Right. Ramesh, you know, I'm glad you cleared all of that up for us, because I think this morning when the news came out, there was a degree of confusion about the terms and conditions, if you will, of this disengagement. Is India withdrawing at the same time as China? And like you said, a lot has been left unsaid. But if I can ask you, without really getting into the semantics of what India has said and what China hasn't, has China's decision not to make a pointed statement about its role in this so-called disengagement a strategic choice? And what exactly will that mean for India in terms of the lead up to the BRICS summit and Prime Minister Modi's continued silence on whether he is or is not going to take part in the summit?
Well, on the face of it, Aisha, all indicators are that Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India will indeed attend the BRICS summit. But the question engaging the attention of many people in New Delhi this afternoon is, did the government of India tell China in so many words that Prime Minister Modi's participation in the BRICS summit will be contingent upon an early resolution of the Doklam standoff? That's the big question that is engaging the attention of many policymakers and diplomats here in India. Did India lean on China and tell it in so many words that, look, Prime Minister Modi will come only if you resolve the Doklam standoff before the summit begins on the 3rd of September. Now, that is still in the realm of speculation. Maybe in the fullness of time, we'll come to an exact detail as to what brought about this disengagement. But the fact remains that India is by and large seen as being vindicated in its position, and it's a diplomatic victory, no doubt, for the Indian officials who've been consistently saying that diplomatic avenues are open and shall continue to be used to resolve the standoff on the Doklam plateau. Okay,
so you mentioned the word speculation, and so I'm going to depart from this probing line that I've been employing so far, Ramesh, because that's something we don't like to do here at WION. But let's talk a little bit about the other player in all of this. You know, it's the two big brothers, India and China, and everyone's been concentrating on them. But what about Bhutan's position? Does that require further examination, keeping today's developments in mind?
Absolutely. There's no denying that Bhutan, to my mind, is the principal or primary aggrieved party in the Doklam dispute. Now, Doklam is Bhutanese territory which China claims as its own. Now, we've seen the standoff last 72 days, Aisha, more than 2 months now. It all began on 16th of June when, according to India, Chinese troops and soldiers came in entered the Doklam plateau with heavy equipment, machinery, earth-moving equipment and bulldozers, ostensibly to create a new road which will come all the way to near the Indian line of actual control. That's how things began. On the 18th of June, 2 days afterwards, according to China, Indian troops allegedly trespassed into their territory with heavy equipment and soldiers, with almost 300 soldiers at one point in time, hand-to-hand combat, as it were, with the Chinese counterparts. So that's how things have panned in the last 2 months. But that said, India has consistently maintained that India was there at the invitation of the Bhutanese government. Remember, India and China enjoy a very close relationship, a security partnership and understanding, and that was the only principal reason why India intervened in the first place. But that said, in the 2 months that the standoff had lasted, Bhutan has issued only one statement, and that is dating back to 29th of June. And since then, there's been complete radio silence from Thimphu, from the Bhutanese government. And one can only expect to hear from Bhutan in the days to going forward as to whether Bhutan is satisfied with the developments of the situation obtaining on the Doklam plateau, even as we speak this afternoon.
Absolutely, and the outcome has had a sort of a shadow over the entire region. I mean, even with Nepal's Prime Minister making his way across to India, it seemed like everything that was discussed between those two parties came to moot, because all the questions there at the briefing were all about Doklam. But Ramesh, going beyond the binaries of whether this was a political or a foreign policy win or loss for India, I just want to ask you, what does this indicate in many ways of India's foreign policy stand? We've seen a resolute, attitude so far. Very few people have gone ahead and spoken about Doklam on the official front, just 2 or 3 at the most. Does this indicate a change in India's stance when it comes to foreign policy, especially when it comes to a towering neighbor such as China?
Absolutely. There's no denying that, Aisha. This government in particular has pursued a policy of what is known as offensive defense, or the so-called Modi-Dowell doctrine. Now, and that was manifested itself in the way India conducted surgical strikes across the line of control against the terrorist hideouts in POK, also along the eastern frontier with Myanmar. And the Doklam standoff is straight out of the Modi-Dowell doctrine of playbook, as it were, where India takes a position to preempt the opponent's moves, as it were. And to my mind, according to a large section of policymakers here in India today, China probably did not anticipate India's moves very clearly, and that, to my mind, is adding a new dimension to India's foreign policy. But that said, specifically about Doklam, Aisha, this incident would not have gone unnoticed among many of China's neighbors, especially those who have been at the receiving end of China's so-called peaceful rise, especially those countries who have a maritime dispute or boundary dispute with China in the South China Sea. Now, China has antagonized neighbors far and wide as far as maritime boundary on the east and the South China Sea goes, and also the land boundary with India. So the way India has stood up to China's bullying tactics, for want of a better word, would be noticed very carefully by many countries in the region and beyond. And all of them would be drawing their own conclusions as to how they would want to deal with China in the days and years and months ahead.
All right, stay with me, Ramesh, just to take our viewers through what exactly was said by the Chinese Foreign Ministry today on the Doklam standoff. Remember, Ramesh pointing out for us, no specific statement from the ministry, just response to certain questions, mainly by Indian journalists. Listen into this bite from the spokesperson.
印方呢已经将越界的人员和设备全部撤回了边界的印方一侧，中方的现场人员对此进行了确认。中方呢将继续按照历史界约规定行使主权权利，维护领土主权。那么我也讲了，鉴于现场的情况已经出现了变化，中方呢将根据现地的情况做出必要的调整和部署。
All right, let's go back to Ramesh Ramachandran from the international desk for more on that story. Ramesh, when it comes to China, especially when it comes to India and China, it's almost a package deal. There's Pakistan that's always included, After the Belt and Road Initiative, India choosing to boycott that by not attending, there was this spectre of BRICS hanging over this engagement, whether the Prime Minister Modi is going to attend or not. Do you think that's had a role to play in I don't want to call it a resolution just yet, that would be jumping the gun, but this, the way things have come to pass as of today on Doklam, do you think BRICS had something to do with it?
Absolutely, Aisha. One cannot but, include that particular aspect or possibility into this whole discourse and narrative, as it were. Remember, it would be a big embarrassment for the Chinese host if any of its members, let alone India, would boycott or not attend or not participate in the BRICS summit. And that, to my mind, is a big incentive for China to also ensure that this issue is resolved before the summit gets underway well and truly. But that said, the BRICS, Aisha, is essentially an economic grouping, and economic issues will be in the forefront of the discussions. And that is also another reason why India and China need to show more maturity than they have ever before in recent times, because at the end of the day, both countries are invested heavily in each other's economy. The trade imbalance, although they might be in against India, but the fact remains that China is also heavily invested in the Indian market, Indian economy, and so is India looking forward to trade with China across many sectors of the Chinese economy. So clearly, it is a win-win proposition for both countries if they can set aside their political differences aside and focus only on the economic benefits for both countries in the near term.
Absolutely. The economics of a standoff between China and India, Ramesh, it's front and center of this entire debate. But thank you very much for joining us on the broadcast with those details. But we'll also, of course, be touching upon the economics of this standoff in our special wallet at 5 p.m. Do tune in to see that. But for more than 70 days, remember, the world's been watching that border standoff between the two major Asian powers. And WION has been your window to understanding this conflict. Catch the biggest voices on India and China talking about Doklam, making sense of it for you right here on WION.